everyone. I want everyone here today to just think back to their last fight. It could have been a heated argument you had with your sibling about who ate the last slice of cake, or a bloody nose you got in middle school after some name calling, or maybe even a nasty email confrontation with someone at work. We've all been there at some point. We've all had to fight for something or someone, to resist something unjust, or to make way for what we believe is right. Fighting is an inevitable part of life. Despite their irrational, messy appearances in media and culture, fights are actually quite rational occurrences. We only fight when we're likely to win, when the cost of engaging is not too high, and most variables are in our control. Without even realizing it, you do this calculation subconsciously during every conflict you engage in. Humans don't like to lose, and we make every effort to not let it happen. But when we raise the stakes, when we start to fight about things like our homeland, our culture, or the integrity of our belief systems, why are we not able to fight like we fight about other things? Where does all that careful consideration go? Why do we choose to fight in conflicts as massive as wars when it costs us so much? We become willing to sacrifice our people's peace, our economies, our social and political freedoms, people's lives, anything and everything that can be given away, leaving behind only a violent history of blood and loss. Everyone sees the glaring asymmetry in cost and benefit analysis, but still signs up. Economic theorists, historians, and many more academic minds have been trying to answer this riddle for ages and have come up with a few reasons why people continue to fight even in unfavorable conditions. In today's presentation, I want to share what I believe is the most important reason, the factor that I have chosen to study and compare against economic and social models of decision making. And that factor is nationalism. In simpler terms, nationalism is a political ideology that puts loyalty and devotion towards one's nation above the individual. There are also many types of nationalism, but most fall under 5 broad categories: ethnic, cultural, civic, ideological, and diaspora nationalism. The granular details that distinguish each from one another are not important to know, but what is shared between them is important. This very intentional cultivation of national fervor for the country, with every act of citizenship being centered on serving and protecting one's homeland, and every economic and human resource being dedicated to its fruition. Well-promoted nationalism is what allowed many authoritarian leaders and regimes to thrive, but no political scientist could have anticipated this ideology's popularity and influence in driving global decisions in the 21st century. Even in a post-Cold War era, an era which was supposed to bring peace, democracy, capitalism, and globalization to the world after years of communist terror, nationalism survived. In fact, it was a key factor in enabling the political growth of countries like the former Soviet Union, Latin America, the Balkans, and Central and Eastern Europe. Even today, nationalism stands as a prevailing ideology, a fact that was exemplified during the pandemic, with even the most democratic countries closing their borders. According to Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage, the pandemic was a time where it seemed we were all nationalists. But there is a very obvious moral ambiguity around nationalism. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Does being a nationalist make you a good citizen or a bad one? While some political theorists like Yoram Hosani believe that nationalism can evoke the best sentiments within society, like a sense of duty, sacrifice, honor, and heroism, many others disagree. French President Macron argues that nationalism erases moral values, and British columnist George Monbiot even goes as far as equating nationalism with racism. Our author Arundhati Roy's critique is one of my favorites. She symbolizes the work of nationalism through flags that are bits of colored cloth that governments use first to shrink wrap people's minds and then as ceremonial shrouds for the dead. But nationalism has not always meant the demise of democracy or the reason for war or discrimination. In fact, some of the world's most powerful movements for peace, freedom, and justice were inspired by nationalism. That unified belief in national solidarity became a reason for the overthrowing of absolutist monarchies and exploitative colonial reigns. No matter which side we look at, whether for good or evil, we must acknowledge that nationalism is a force to be reckoned with, especially when it comes to decision making. So I'd like to revisit the question I first asked you, which was, why do we fight even when the cost is irreparable? In the field of economics, there is a bargaining model that can be used to answer this question. And my research paper explores the intersection between a specific type of nationalism known as ethnic nationalism and this model. In simpler terms, my research focuses on how ethnic nationalism functions as a variable in James Fearon's bargaining model of war. Fearon's bargaining model of war is based on the premise that war is a costly lottery, and if states are rational entities, know what they're capable of, while also knowing how stubborn their opponents are, they would prefer to settle conflicts through negotiation rather than resorting to war. Since both parties have costs, a bargaining range of outcomes is created through which both parties can negotiate alternatives to war. However, we know that some conflicts still escalate to wars despite the existence of a bargaining range, and Fearon's theory explains three hypotheses for why this happens. The first describes incomplete information regarding the adversary's strength and resolve. Miscalculations can lead to nation-states overestimating their strength and potential chances of winning if there were a war. Overall, it is difficult for nation-states to determine the true caliber and commitment of their adversaries, as during negotiations, both parties have incentives to misrepresent in order to achieve a more favorable negotiation at the bargaining table. And while exaggerating one's power and capabilities might seem like a good bargaining tactic, this can increase misinformation and further contribute to states overestimating their strategic positions and falling prey to costly wars. The same scenario can be used to describe Fearon's second hypothesis, coined commitment problems. Suppose party A and B represent states potentially going to war due to a conflict. Even if both parties are fully aware of the other's power and determination, they could automatically go to war if there's a shift in power balance or if said victory in said conflict is a source of power in itself. This commitment problem theory states that perfectly informed states can negotiate a mutually acceptable deal under certain conditions if they remain static. However, when there is shifting power, there is no guarantee that the more powerful nation will not try to take advantage of the less powerful one in the future, despite such action breaking the agreement made in the past when there was no power imbalance. Power shifts are often the reason many wars are fought by declining states in the present to avoid fighting similar conflicts in the future when they are at a disadvantage and more vulnerable. Lastly, Fearon describes indivisibility as an interference to negotiations. A mutually agreeable resolution to a conflict may not be possible if the commodity at stake is not divisible in a way that does not decrease its value. For instance, religious and cultural heritage sites, as well as strategically valuable areas of land, are difficult to divide in a way that lies within the bargaining range and keeps the parties involved satisfied. As a result, indivisibility can interfere with successful negotiations, even when both nation states are fully informed of the other's power, and also when there is no shifting power. Now, coming to my chosen variable of ethnic nationalism. This is a brand of nationalism that states one's nation and nationality is defined by their ethnicity, and a hierarchy is usually imposed to disenfranchise a particular group in that society. One of the core principles of ethno-nationalist states nations are defined by a shared heritage, which usually includes a common language, a common faith, and a common ethnic ancestry. How this kind of nationalism fits in Fearon's bargaining model of war is a relatively new area of discussion, and thus, my paper aims to explore how a variable like ethnic nationalism can affect the bargaining range within this model by comparing them to real conflicts. Through my preliminary research, I've made a few key hypotheses. The first is that because nationalistic sentiment is so heavily tied to personal identity and pride, it can desensitize citizens to the costs of war, raising the stakes to the point where any form of negotiation or concession exchange becomes difficult, if not impossible. I believe this key characteristic of nationalism is what lowers the likelihood of peaceful resolutions. Ethnic nationalism also significantly influences the likelihood of political leaders committing to their decisions. Leaders who are swayed by strong nationalistic sentiment may have a harder time committing to negotiations that compromise on their ethnic identity in any shape or form, exacerbating commitment problems. Their loyalty and emotional attachment to a specific ethnic group can interfere with their ability to credibly commit to terms that lie within the bargaining range, but compete with their previous commitment to the agendas of their ethnic group. In turn, If the opposing country is worried about the credibility and commitment of their adversary, they may be more hesitant to agree on settlements that don't completely eliminate the threat at hand. In this way, ethnic nationalism shortens the bargaining range to a point where war is way more likely than negotiated peace. My second hypothesis is that ethnic nationalism exacerbates the issue of indivisibility that I mentioned earlier. Cultural and ethnic identity are often abstract and intangible, which often makes them appear non-negotiable in nature. What I mean by this is that it is harder to make concessions on one's identity and culture, and as a result, the peaceful resolution of conflict is less likely due to an increase in the perceived cost of compromises and negotiations. Also, since cultural and ethnic values are subjective, leaders are more likely to exploit this ambiguity and distort the true necessity of a concession or negotiation term to further their personal political agenda. To summarize, since the perceived costs of bargaining have increased, the perceived costs of war have also decreased, making the outcome of war, once again, more likely. My third and final theory suggests that ethnic nationalism might lead to escalation tendencies during conflict because conflicts involving ethnic and cultural issues can bias leaders' decision making. For instance, leaders may be more likely to resort to using nationalistic rhetoric in their policies or publicized media outlets to increase their political support from their ethnic nationalist voters during a time of inherent instability. This rhetoric can negatively impact the relationship between the country and its adversary, leading to a cycle of escalation where each side feels pressured or emotionally inclined to respond to provocations by the opposing side, leading to more fuel being added to the conflict, which again sets the context for a higher than necessary stakes negotiation and lowers the chances for a peaceful resolution. Okay, so I've been going on about nationalism for a while now, but you may be thinking, why is this research even necessary? Why is it necessary for us to understand Furon's model? Why should we even care or be critical of wars that seem inevitable? Well, the answer to these questions lie in the kind of reality we are experiencing today. Look in any part of the world. You will either find the flames of a new conflict or the burning embers of an older one. There is only one antidote to all this destruction: understanding how peace can be negotiated even in the presence of forces as strong as ethnic nationalism. Understanding how variables like nationalism can affect decision making can guide better policy formation, conflict resolution, and peace building. It can also help create effective negotiation strategies that consider ethnic sensitivities and identity concerns. If policymakers and mediators develop strategies sensitive to ethnic identities, the likelihood of successful negotiations increases. Insights from this research can also contribute to conflict prevention efforts by addressing the root causes of ethnic nationalism that exacerbate conflicts. Early interventions based on this research might mitigate the influence of ethnic identity on political decisions and promote more inclusive national identities. While there are many more applications and considerations to this work, I hope I've conveyed the importance of learning the strategies of peace building in a more rigorous and evidence based way. This could mean taking this research one step further and conducting longitudinal studies to track how ethnic nationalism evolves over time and impacts negotiation processes. Additionally, conducting comparative studies between different regions or countries with varying levels of ethnic nationalism could help identify patterns and variations in how ethnic identity actually influences conflict and negotiation. In today's talk, I've spent most of my time trying to explain why we fight, even when it's irrational to do so. I've given you reason after reason on why people make terrible decisions, especially when it comes to our national pride and personal identities. But in doing so, I hope I've given you more reasons to not fight, to be critical of how decisions are made, and maintain rationality even in front of the most persuasive monsters. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Anna, for that very insightful and topical presentation on conflict and ethno-nationalism, linking kind of the national to the individual.
Thank you.
With really widespread implications and some serious and radical prescriptions for the world order today. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.